The 1960s were full of bold ideas, but not all of them were smart ones. In a rush to stand out, some automakers built cars with pointless features, baffling designs, and engineering decisions that made absolutely no sense, even back then. They weren't ahead of their time, they were just stupid. No wonder history quietly forgot them. These are 10 truly stupid cars from the 1960s everyone forgot about. The Chevrolet Corvair Greenbrier is one of those vehicles that only makes sense if you imagine General Motors in the early 1960s as a vast laboratory where ideas were approved simply because nobody had ever tried them before. On paper, the concept sounded clever, even progressive. Take the compact, modern Corvair with its air-cooled flat six and rear-engine layout, stretch the body upward into a boxy van shape, add sliding doors and passenger seating, and sell it as a futuristic family and commercial vehicle. In reality, the Greenbrier became a rolling lesson in why certain engineering layouts exist for very specific reasons and should never be casually repurposed. The heart of the problem was the engine placement. That air-cooled flat six sat entirely behind the rear axle, exactly where you might tolerate it in a low, lightweight compact car, but absolutely where you did not want it in a tall, slab-sided van. The Greenbrier's center of gravity was already compromised by its height, and then GM piled the heaviest mechanical component as far rearward as possible. Once passengers, luggage, or cargo were added, weight distribution became almost comically rear-biased. Owners quickly learned that the handling changed dramatically depending on how many people were inside and where they were sitting. Empty, it felt twitchy and unpredictable. Loaded, it felt like the rear of the vehicle was constantly trying to lead the front. On the road, the driving experience was unsettling, even for early 1960s standards. Steering was extremely light, not in a reassuring way, but in a disconnected, vague manner that left drivers guessing how much grip the front tires actually had. At highway speeds, especially on American interstates where crosswinds were common, the Greenbrier demanded constant correction. A gust of wind could shove the tall body sideways, and the rear engine layout meant recovery was slow and unnerving. Drivers described the sensation as balancing a refrigerator on roller skates. Braking only added to the stress. With so much weight over the rear and relatively modest brakes, stopping distances were long and inconsistent, particularly when the van was fully loaded. Suspension design did the Greenbrier no favors either. Borrowed heavily from the Corvair passenger car, it was never truly adapted to van duty. Rear camber changes under load could be dramatic, contributing to sudden and unexpected handling shifts. Combined with narrowed tires and drum brakes all around, the Greenbrier punished inattentive drivers. It was not a vehicle you could relax in. Every trip required focus, anticipation, and a kind of mechanical sympathy that most families buying a people mover simply did not have. Inside, practicality was only marginally better. The flat floor and boxy shape promised utility, but engine noise, heat management issues, and limited power meant the Greenbrier struggled under real-world conditions. Climbing hills with a full load was an exercise in patience. The air-cooled engine worked hard, sometimes too hard, and maintenance access was awkward at best. Comfort was basic, even by the standards of the era, and long trips amplified every flaw. Owners later joked that the van felt less like a family vehicle and more like a prototype that had accidentally made it into showrooms. What truly makes the Corvair Greenbrier fascinating is not just that it was flawed, but that it was flawed in such an obvious, avoidable way. GM already had front-engine vans. The Greenbrier existed because someone inside the company believed buyers would accept radical engineering if it looked modern and different. That belief underestimated how quickly ordinary drivers notice instability, strange handling, and fear at highway speed. As safety scrutiny increased throughout the 1960s, especially with the broader backlash against the Corvair platform itself, the Greenbrier's fate was sealed. It quietly disappeared, remembered mostly by enthusiasts and former owners who survived it. Today, the Corvair Greenbrier stands as a perfect example of corporate optimism colliding with physical reality.
It is weird not because it was ugly or rare, but because it represents a moment when a massive manufacturer convinced itself that basic physics could be ignored for the sake of novelty. It was a family van that behaved like a nervous experiment, a people carrier that demanded race driver attention, and a reminder that not every bold idea deserves to leave the lab.
The Ford Mustang station wagon concept is one of those ideas that sounds mildly interesting in hindsight, but collapses completely once you place it back into its original historical and cultural context. In the mid-1960s, the Mustang was not just another Ford model, it was a phenomenon. It represented youth, rebellion, affordability, and a kind of personal freedom that American buyers had not really been offered before. It was long hood, short deck, flashy, loud, and unapologetically selfish. Turning that car into a station wagon was not simply a design stretch, it was a philosophical contradiction. Internally, the idea came from a very corporate place. The Mustang was selling incredibly well, and Ford management began asking the most dangerous question any successful company can ask: how far can we stretch this name? Wagons were still popular in the mid-1960s, especially with families, and Ford wondered whether Mustang magic could be applied to a more practical body style. A few prototypes and coach-built conversions appeared, usually based on early first-generation Mustangs with extended roofs, longer rear glass, and modified tailgates. On paper, it looked like an attempt to create a sporty lifestyle wagon before that term even existed. In reality, it exposed exactly why some cars should never be diluted. Visually, the Mustang wagon looked wrong from almost every angle. The original Mustang's design relied heavily on its proportions: a long hood suggesting performance, a compact cabin, and a short rear deck that made the car look fast even when parked. Adding a wagon roof destroyed that balance instantly. The rear became heavy and visually bloated, the roofline awkwardly extended, and the fastback or notchback elegance was replaced by something confused and clumsy. It no longer looked like a Mustang, but it also did not look like a proper wagon. It existed in an uncomfortable middle ground that satisfied nobody. The engineering problems only made things worse. The Mustang platform was never designed to carry significant rear weight or cargo. Adding a wagon body increased mass where the suspension and chassis were least prepared for it. Handling suffered noticeably. The car lost much of its nimbleness, rear-end behavior became less predictable under load, and ride quality deteriorated. Any illusion of sporty driving evaporated once the rear was filled with cargo or passengers. What remained was a compromised vehicle that did nothing particularly well. Then there was the question Ford could never answer. Who was this car actually for? Young buyers, the very people who made the Mustang a success, had zero interest in station wagons. Wagons were associated with parents, responsibility, and suburbia, the exact things Mustang marketing was trying to escape. At the same time, families who needed wagons valued space, comfort, safety, and durability. They had no interest in a low-slung pony car with limited rear access, questionable cargo practicality, and a performance-oriented image that felt inappropriate for school runs and grocery trips. The Mustang wagon sat between two demographics that did not overlap. Even inside Ford, enthusiasm for the idea faded quickly. Executives reportedly recognized that the Mustang name was being stretched beyond its breaking point. Unlike later successful spin-offs, such as the Mustang Mach-E decades later, this was not an evolution of the brand, but a dilution of it. The Mustang was supposed to be aspirational and emotional, not rational and utilitarian. Turning it into a wagon made it ordinary, and worse, slightly embarrassing. Ford quietly allowed the idea to die without ever seriously pushing it toward production. What makes the Mustang station wagon concept truly interesting today is not that it was rare or mysterious, but that it serves as a case study in brand misunderstanding. It proves that not every successful car can be everything at once. Some vehicles are powerful precisely because they refuse practicality. The Mustang wagon is forgotten because it violated the core reason the Mustang existed at all.
It did not fail dramatically, it simply faded away, quietly acknowledged as a mistake by the very people who considered building it. In hindsight, the concept feels almost naive. It assumed that a badge alone could override identity, proportions, and purpose. The Mustang station wagon was killed not by regulations, safety concerns, or market shifts. It was killed by common sense. And in a way, that makes it one of the most honest failures in automotive history.
The AMC Marlin is one of those cars that perfectly captures the dangers of chasing a trend without fully understanding it. In the mid-1960s, the American market was falling in love with the idea of the personal luxury car. Vehicles like the Ford Thunderbird, Buick Riviera, and later the Oldsmobile Toronado proved that buyers wanted style, individuality, and a sense of prestige without committing to a full-size luxury sedan. AMC, always desperate to be seen as innovative and relevant, wanted a piece of that market badly. The Marlin was their answer, but it was an answer to a question they never fully understood. On paper, the concept sounded promising. A sleek, fastback roof, a long profile, and a focus on comfort rather than outright performance. The problem was that AMC didn't start with a clean sheet design. Instead, the Marlin was built on existing AMC platforms, first the Rambler Classic and later the larger Ambassador. This decision immediately doomed the car's proportions. The fastback roof was stretched awkwardly over a body that was never designed for it, creating a silhouette that looked heavy and unbalanced. The roofline was too long, the rear deck too bulky, and the overall stance felt clumsy. From certain angles, the Marlin looked like it was sagging under its own weight. Visually, the car struggled to decide what it wanted to be. The fastback suggested sportiness, but the massive body and conservative front end contradicted that message. It didn't have the sharp elegance of a Riviera or the confident presence of a Thunderbird. Instead, it looked hesitant, as if the designers themselves weren't convinced. Rear visibility was notoriously bad, with the long, sloping glass creating blind spots that made lane changes stressful. The huge rear window also turned the cabin into a greenhouse, trapping heat and making summer driving uncomfortable. Mechanically, the Marlin was equally confused. AMC offered respectable V8s, but the car was heavy, and performance never matched its sporty appearance. Acceleration was adequate at best, and handling was soft and uninspiring. It was tuned more like a family sedan than a personal luxury coupe, which meant it floated rather than carved through corners. Drivers expecting something engaging were disappointed, while luxury buyers found the ride quality and interior materials lacking compared to rivals. The cabin felt more like a dressed-up Rambler than a true premium experience, with cost-cutting evident in trim, switches, and overall finish. The market response reflected this confusion. Buyers didn't know how to categorize the Marlin, and neither did dealers. It was priced too high to attract AMC's traditional budget-conscious customers, yet it lacked the prestige and refinement to lure buyers away from established luxury names. Sales were disappointing from the start, and word of mouth didn't help. Owners often remarked that the car was comfortable enough, but emotionally empty, a vehicle that never made them feel special despite its dramatic shape. The oft-repeated phrase among enthusiasts today, "a beautiful idea and a terrible execution," sums it up perfectly. Internally, AMC knew they had miscalculated. The company was already operating with limited resources, and the Marlin's failure hurt more than it would have at a larger manufacturer. After only a few years, the model was quietly dropped. AMC shifted its focus back to smaller, more practical cars, and later to genuinely bold ideas like the Javelin and AMX, which at least committed fully to performance and identity. The Marlin, by contrast, was quietly buried in the corporate memory, rarely mentioned in retrospectives.
Today, the AMC Marlin exists in a strange place among collectors. It's rare, distinctive, and undeniably a product of its time, but it's still hard to love unconditionally. Some appreciate it precisely because of its flaws, seeing it as a brave but misguided attempt by an underdog company to punch above its weight. Others see it as a warning sign, a reminder that style without purpose and ambition without clarity can produce something that feels hollow. The Marlin didn't fail because it was daring. It failed because it never decided what it truly wanted to be.
The Dodge Deora deserves an even harsher and more honest examination because it perfectly represents a moment when American car culture confused spectacle with progress. Created at a time when auto shows were becoming theaters rather than technical showcases, the Deora was less a vehicle and more a rolling provocation. It was built to be stared at, photographed, and remembered, not driven, lived with, or understood as transportation. The designers and promoters spoke about it as if it were a glimpse into tomorrow, but there was nothing forward-thinking about ignoring how people actually use cars. It assumed a future where comfort, safety, accessibility, and practicality simply stopped mattering, replaced entirely by shock value. Even structurally, the Deora was compromised. The extreme body modifications required to achieve its shape weakened the original utility-focused platform it was based on. The chassis was never intended for such radical proportions, and the resulting vehicle felt fragile and awkward despite its aggressive appearance. Weight distribution was poor, suspension geometry was compromised, and the ride quality reflected that. Driving it was not an experience of futuristic smoothness, but one of constant awareness that the car was fighting itself. Every bump, every turn, every stop reminded the driver that this was a sculpture, pretending to be a machine. The windshield entry concept alone disqualifies it as anything resembling a serious automobile. It assumed ideal conditions at all times. No rain, no snow, no tight parking spaces, no aging drivers, no emergencies. Imagine trying to exit quickly after an accident, or simply getting in while wearing normal clothing. The concept collapses the moment real life intrudes. This was not a small oversight, it was a complete rejection of reality. The designers chose drama over dignity, appearance over humanity. In that sense, the Deora is almost arrogant, a car that expects the world to adapt to it rather than the other way around. What makes the Deora especially revealing is how quickly its real-world relevance vanished while its toy version flourished. As a Hot Wheels icon, it became immortal. Children embraced it not because it made sense, but because it didn't have to. In miniature form, the Deora's flaws disappear. There is no discomfort at a 1:64 scale, no visibility issues, no safety concerns, just shape, color, and attitude. The toy version is honest in a way the real car never was. It admits that this design is fantasy, not function. Collectors today often praise the Deora as bold, daring, and influential, but those compliments usually stop at aesthetics. Very few people argue that it was a good vehicle, because it wasn't. It didn't influence production cars in any meaningful way. No future vans adopted its ideas. No manufacturers seriously revisited its concepts for daily use. Its influence was cultural, not technical. It showed how far styling could be pushed before usability collapsed completely. In hindsight, the Deora feels like a warning disguised as optimism. It shows what happens when design becomes disconnected from purpose, when excitement replaces responsibility. It's remembered not because it pointed the way forward, but because it went so far in the wrong direction that it became unforgettable. As a piece of automotive pop culture, it succeeded brilliantly. As a car, it failed almost completely. And the fact that its greatest legacy lives in toy boxes rather than driveways is not an accident. It is the most honest verdict on what the Dodge Deora truly was. The Renault Dauphine's failure in the United States is a textbook example of cultural and engineering mismatch. And the deeper you look, the worse it gets. In post-war Europe, the Dauphine made sense. Roads were narrow, fuel was expensive, speeds were low, and expectations were modest. In that environment, a small, rear-engine sedan with light steering and minimal power could feel charming, efficient, even progressive. But exporting that same car to mid-century America without fundamentally rethinking it was not optimism, it was delusion. American highways in the late 1950s and early 1960s were fast, wide, and brutal. Sustained speeds of 65 to 75 miles per hour were normal. Summers were hotter, distances were longer, and traffic was heavier. The Dauphine's tiny engine was never designed for that reality. Pushing it at American cruising speeds meant constant high RPM operation, which led to overheating, valve issues, and premature engine failure. Owners quickly learned that the car could technically reach highway speed, but doing so felt like mechanical abuse. Many described driving it flat out just to keep up with traffic, listening to the engine scream as if it were begging for mercy. Rust was another fatal flaw, and not a minor one. The Dauphine's body protection was inadequate even by European standards, but in American climates it was catastrophic. Cars began rusting through in a matter of years, sometimes months, especially in northern states. Floor pans dissolved, structural components weakened, and doors sagged. American buyers were used to cars that physically aged slowly, even if they mechanically wore out. Watching a relatively new car rot from the inside out felt insulting. The Dauphine gave the impression of being temporary by design, a car that assumed its own short lifespan. Then there was quality control, or rather the lack of it. Electrical issues were common, trim fell off, interiors aged poorly, and tolerances felt sloppy. American consumers were forgiving of quirks in domestic cars, but they expected size, durability, and serviceability in return. The Dauphine offered none of that. Worse still, Renault's dealer network in the U.S. was thin, inexperienced, and often clueless. Mechanics unfamiliar with rear engine layouts misdiagnosed problems or made them worse. Parts could take weeks to arrive. A simple repair often turned into an extended ordeal, leaving owners stranded or angry. Handling, often praised in Europe, became another liability. The rear engine layout produced unpredictable behavior at higher speeds, especially in crosswinds or emergency maneuvers. American drivers were not trained for this kind of dynamic, and the Dauphine offered little warning before things went wrong. At highway speeds, it felt nervous and light, almost disconnected from the road. In an era before widespread safety regulations, that nervousness translated directly into fear. The psychological damage to Renault's reputation was enormous. For many Americans, the Dauphine was their first exposure to a French car, and it was a terrible introduction. The narrative quickly became that French cars were fragile, underbuilt, and unsuitable for American life. Even when later Renault products were objectively better, the stigma remained. The Dauphine didn't just fail as a product, it poisoned the well. What makes the story especially painful is that the Dauphine didn't have to fail this badly. With proper adaptation, stronger rust protection, better cooling, and a realistic understanding of American expectations, it might have carved out a niche. Instead, it arrived unchanged, unprepared, and misunderstood. American owners didn't reject it because it was foreign. They rejected it because it felt like it didn't respect where it was being sold. In retrospect, the Dauphine in the U.S. feels like a car sent into an environment it could not survive, blamed for failing, and then abandoned. It wasn't stupid by design, but selling it in America without evolution was. And for many buyers, it wasn't just a bad car, it was a betrayal, one that ensured Renault would spend decades trying and failing to regain American trust. The Oldsmobile Toronado U-Turner concept is one of those ideas that looks clever on paper and dramatic on an auto show stand, but collapses the moment you think about actually living with it.
The standard Toronado was a genuine engineering achievement. Front-wheel drive in a full-size American coupe with real power was not a gimmick, it was a solution. It delivered flat floors, good winter traction, and impressive straight-line stability. The U-Turner, however, wasn't interested in balance or usefulness. It was interested in shock value. The entire concept revolved around exaggerating the Tornato's front-wheel drive layout to the extreme. The proportions were distorted, the stance exaggerated, and the steering geometry pushed into experimental territory. The idea was to demonstrate maneuverability, packaging efficiency, and technological daring, but what it actually demonstrated was how quickly good engineering turns into theater when limits are ignored. The car looked aggressive and futuristic, but it no longer felt like a car designed around human behavior or real roads. From an engineering perspective, the handling problems were obvious. Extreme front-wheel drive geometry placed enormous stress on the front tires. Torque steer was not just present, it dominated the driving experience. Under acceleration, the steering wheel fought the driver constantly. Tire wear was absurdly high, not over years but over test sessions. Engineers reported uneven wear patterns that made consistent handling impossible. The front end carried too much responsibility, propulsion, steering, and most of the braking, while the rear felt passive and disconnected, like it was just being dragged along. The driving feel was another issue that quietly killed the concept. Test drivers described it as strange and artificial. The car responded quickly to inputs, but not naturally. There was no sense of progressive feedback, no gradual buildup of grip. It either turned or it didn't, and when it didn't, it did so abruptly. For a brand like Oldsmobile, which was supposed to represent smoothness, refinement, and controlled innovation, this was a philosophical mismatch. The U-Turner felt nervous, busy, and tiring, the opposite of what a Toronado buyer would have wanted. Internally, GM engineers understood the problem immediately. The U-Turner was excellent at proving that front-wheel drive could be pushed further than anyone expected, but it also proved why it shouldn't be. The compromises required to make it usable would have erased everything that made the concept dramatic in the first place. To civilize it, they would have needed to soften steering ratios, reduce power delivery, redesign suspension pickup points, and fundamentally change its proportions. What remained would no longer be the U-Turner, just a watered-down Toronado with awkward styling. There was also the issue of perception. The concept didn't suggest a future people wanted. It didn't hint at better comfort, improved safety, or easier ownership. It hinted at complexity, unusual behavior, and potential reliability nightmares. In a period when American buyers were already becoming wary of experimental technology, the U-Turner felt like a risk without a reward. Even within GM, it was seen as a showpiece rather than a roadmap. That is why it disappeared quietly. There was no public cancellation, no official rejection. It simply stopped being mentioned. It had served its purpose as a demonstration, and everyone involved understood that turning it into a production vehicle would have damaged the Toronado's reputation rather than enhanced it. The base Toronado was innovative in a way customers could understand and appreciate. The U-Turner was innovative in a way that only engineers and designers found interesting. In hindsight, the Oldsmobile Toronado U-Turner represents the fine line between meaningful progress and self-indulgent experimentation. It wasn't a failure because it didn't work. It was a failure because it worked too well at revealing its own flaws. It proved that not every technical possibility deserves to become a product, and sometimes the smartest decision a manufacturer can make is to walk away quietly before a bold idea turns into a public mistake.
The Dodge Deora deserves an even harsher and more honest examination because it perfectly represents a moment when American car culture confused spectacle with progress. Created at a time when auto shows were becoming theaters rather than technical showcases, the Deora was less a vehicle and more a rolling provocation. It was built to be stared at, photographed, and remembered, not driven, lived with, or understood as transportation. The designers and promoters spoke about it as if it were a glimpse into tomorrow, but there was nothing forward-thinking about ignoring how people actually use cars. It assumed a future where comfort, safety, accessibility, and practicality simply stopped mattering, replaced entirely by shock value. Even structurally, the Deora was compromised. The extreme body modifications required to achieve its shape weakened the original utility-focused platform it was based on. The chassis was never intended for such radical proportions, and the resulting vehicle felt fragile and awkward despite its aggressive appearance. Weight distribution was poor, suspension geometry was compromised, and the ride quality reflected that. Driving it was not an experience of futuristic smoothness, but one of constant awareness that the car was fighting itself. Every bump, every turn, every stop reminded the driver that this was a sculpture, pretending to be a machine. The windshield entry concept alone disqualifies it as anything resembling a serious automobile. It assumed ideal conditions at all times. No rain, no snow, no tight parking spaces, no aging drivers, no emergencies. Imagine trying to exit quickly after an accident, or simply getting in while wearing normal clothing. The concept collapses the moment real life intrudes. This was not a small oversight, it was a complete rejection of reality. The designers chose drama over dignity, appearance over humanity. In that sense, the Deora is almost arrogant, a car that expects the world to adapt to it rather than the other way around. What makes the Deora especially revealing is how quickly its real-world relevance vanished, while its toy version flourished. As a Hot Wheels icon, it became immortal. Children embraced it not because it made sense, but because it didn't have to. In miniature form, the Deora's flaws disappear. There is no discomfort at a 1:64 scale, no visibility issues, no safety concerns, just shape, color, and attitude. The toy version is honest in a way the real car never was. It admits that this design is fantasy, not function. Collectors today often praise the Deora as bold, daring, and influential, but those compliments usually stop at aesthetics. Very few people argue that it was a good vehicle, because it wasn't. It didn't influence production cars in any meaningful way. No future vans adopted its ideas. No manufacturers seriously revisited its concepts for daily use. Its influence was cultural, not technical. It showed how far styling could be pushed before usability collapsed completely. In hindsight, the Deora feels like a warning disguised as optimism. It shows what happens when design becomes disconnected from purpose, when excitement replaces responsibility. It's remembered not because it pointed the way forward, but because it went so far in the wrong direction that it became unforgettable. As a piece of automotive pop culture, it succeeded brilliantly. As a car, it failed almost completely. And the fact that its greatest legacy lives in toy boxes rather than driveways is not an accident. It is the most honest verdict on what the Dodge Deora truly was.
The Chrysler Turbine car remains one of the most mesmerizing what-if vehicles in automotive history, a machine that existed somewhere between science fiction and corporate bravado. At its heart was the turbine engine, an exotic piece of engineering that could run on nearly any combustible material, diesel, kerosene, even tequila, according to promotional lore. It delivered a hauntingly smooth whine instead of the clatter of a piston engine, and could idle for hours without vibration, creating the sensation of driving a vehicle from the future. It was, for all intents and purposes, a rolling marvel of technology, and Chrysler's marketing team leaned into that narrative hard. Every public demonstration, every test drive, made it feel like America had suddenly leaped decades ahead in propulsion technology. But reality was brutally unkind. Turbines inherently operate at extremely high temperatures, and managing heat proved a nightmare in a conventional car chassis. The exhaust became dangerously hot, capable of burning paint, asphalt, or an unwary bystander if parked improperly. Throttle response was slow and disconnected, the opposite of what drivers expect from a performance car. Press the accelerator expecting an immediate surge, and instead you got a delayed, almost eerie progression, as though the car was alive on its own terms. The sensation was alien, beautiful in a laboratory, infuriating in traffic. Fuel economy compounded the problem. Turbines are most efficient at steady high speeds, not the stop-and-go realities of suburban or city driving. The turbine car guzzled fuel in a way that no contemporary American buyer could justify, especially when piston engine alternatives were cheap, plentiful, and reliable. The smoothness, the futuristic novelty, the promise of almost magical fuel versatility, all of it collided head-on with practicality, affordability, and common sense. Maintenance was another hidden disaster. Unlike traditional engines, the turbine could not be serviced easily at a typical dealership. Only Chrysler technicians, intimately familiar with the rare components and tolerances, could keep the engine running. This requirement effectively turned owners into caretakers of an exotic prototype, not drivers of a normal car. Tires, brakes, suspension, everything else was relatively conventional, but combined with the turbine's quirks, the car became unpredictable in ordinary hands. Even seasoned drivers admitted that parking on a hot day or negotiating rush hour traffic required a mental recalibration, a level of mindfulness most people weren't willing to commit to for a daily driver. Public reaction was a mix of awe and apprehension. Ride-alongs at auto shows drew crowds in the thousands, people mesmerized by the smooth, otherworldly howl and the impossibly serene acceleration. Yet when a few vehicles were loaned to private owners for extended periods, feedback became more practical. "It's amazing, but I can't use it like a normal car," became a refrain repeated in letters, press coverage, and internal memos. Owners loved the novelty, but the car's impracticality and strangeness quickly became apparent. Ultimately, Chrysler made the painful but inevitable decision to destroy most of the turbine cars. Only a handful survived in museums and private collections. The destruction was not a failure of engineering. The turbine ran flawlessly in controlled conditions. It wasn't a failure of imagination. The car looked futuristic and sounded like nothing else on the road. It failed because it could not exist in the world where most cars live, one of parking lots, long commutes, unpredictable drivers, and fuel constraints. Its very perfection as an engineering exercise made it impossible as a practical, usable automobile. Today, the Chrysler Turbine car is remembered as an icon of audacity, a machine that blurred the line between experiment and fantasy. It proves that sometimes the most fascinating vehicles are not the ones you drive every day, but the ones that challenge your expectations and then vanish, leaving only stories of what could have been. Its legacy is one of beauty, intellect, and inevitability, brilliant, dangerous, and entirely unsuited for the ordinary world. The NSU Ro80 is one of those rare cars that looks like it was plucked from a science fiction novel, yet comes with a cautionary tale about ambition exceeding execution. From the very first glance, the car impressed. Its clean, wedge-shaped body, sweeping lines, and almost monolithic glass panels gave it a futuristic presence decades ahead of its time. Unlike the bulbous, chrome-heavy sedans of the late 1960s, the Ro80 projected purpose, intelligence, and restraint. The design was aerodynamic in a subtle way, with a nearly drag-free silhouette, hidden wipers, and flush-mounted trim that hinted at the careful thought behind every surface. Inside, the cabin was airy, comfortable, and driver-focused. Controls were laid out logically, seats were supportive, and the ride quality suggested that NSU engineers were thinking in terms of refinement and long-distance comfort, not just speed or style. But the heart of the Ro80 was where the story turns both brilliant and tragic, the Wankel rotary engine. At the time, it represented the cutting edge of engineering, a revolutionary alternative to piston-based engines. Compact, lightweight, and capable of astonishingly high RPMs without vibration, it seemed the perfect complement to the Ro80's sleek and advanced body. On paper, the rotary engine was elegant.
It promised smooth, silent performance, fewer moving parts, and a driving experience unlike anything else on the road. For enthusiasts and engineers, it was an intoxicating concept, one that screamed progress and innovation. The reality, however, was far less forgiving. The rotary engine depended heavily on apex seals to maintain compression, and these seals proved to be a weak point under real-world conditions. Manufacturing tolerances were tight, and even minor deviations could lead to catastrophic failure. Engines often required major rebuilds at shockingly low mileage, sometimes under 20,000 miles. Reliability was inconsistent, and ordinary owners were ill-equipped to maintain or repair such a complex machine. Service networks were unprepared, parts were specialized, and repair costs were high. The very thing that made the Ro80 revolutionary, the smooth, quiet rotary engine, also made it fragile, expensive, and often exasperating. Owners quickly became polarized. When the Ro80 functioned properly, it was extraordinary. Acceleration was linear and effortless, engine vibrations were minimal, and the car handled with poise and predictability uncommon for a mid-sized European sedan of the era. It felt light, responsive, and remarkably stable. The driving experience could feel magical, a near-future glimpse into what automobiles could be if designers and engineers were unshackled by convention. Yet the car was notorious for failing at the worst possible moments. A seemingly perfect engine could seize or leak, leaving drivers stranded and frustrated. For some, ownership became a near-constant battle with mechanical failure. Letters, dealer complaints, and press reports quickly painted the Ro80 as unreliable, temperamental, and high maintenance, even though it excelled where it worked. The financial consequences for NSU were severe. Warranty costs skyrocketed, parts and labor expenses mounted, and the company's reputation suffered irreparably. What was supposed to be a halo car to elevate the brand became a liability. NSU poured resources into trying to rectify the issues, improving apex seals, refining engine components, and redesigning service processes, but the market had already decided that the Ro80 was risky and unpredictable. Meanwhile, competitors continued to refine proven technology, and the Ro80's early failures overshadowed its technological genius. Despite its commercial and mechanical troubles, the Ro80 left an indelible mark on automotive history. Its aerodynamic profile influenced the design of later European sedans, its interior ergonomics inspired driver-focused layouts for decades, and its audacious use of the rotary engine pushed engineering boundaries that few dared to challenge. The car even enjoyed limited success in motorsport and long-distance reliability events once owners understood how to care for the rotary engine properly. Collectors today prize original Ro80s not just for their rarity, but for their story. A bold, beautiful, and forward-thinking vehicle that demanded intelligence, care, and patience to operate correctly. The NSU Ro80 is ultimately a car of contradictions. It embodies brilliance and folly, beauty and frustration, promise and peril. It is admired for its styling, engineering ambition, and driving refinement, yet reviled by those who experienced its temperamental heart firsthand. It stands as a perfect illustration of how innovation outpaces practicality, how a brilliant idea can be punished by the harsh realities of mass production, and how a car can simultaneously inspire awe and ignite exasperation. For historians and enthusiasts alike, the Ro80 is more than a car. It is a lesson, a myth, and a masterpiece, all rolled into one. A symbol of what happens when vision leaps far ahead of execution.
The Amphicar 770 occupies a rare and almost absurd niche in automotive history, a vehicle designed to defy the most basic expectations of practicality and logic. On paper, the idea was irresistible, a car that could seamlessly transition from pavement to water, delivering the ultimate freedom for adventurous drivers. Imagine rolling down a road, then driving straight into a lake or harbor, with the same machine effortlessly becoming a boat. The novelty and spectacle were undeniable, and at the time of its release in the 1960s, it captured imaginations. Car shows, advertisements, and newsreels all celebrated the Amphicar as a technological marvel, a symbol of post-war optimism and ingenuity. In reality, the Amphicar was a masterclass in compromise. On land, it was slow, underpowered, and prone to wandering on highways. Its lightweight, watertight body meant it lacked the stability and rigidity of a conventional car. Steering was vague, brakes were weak, and handling was tentative at best. Drivers often described it as an adventure just to get from one town to another without incident. Off the pavement, the experience grew even stranger. The Amphicar used twin propellers at the rear to move through water, which limited speed to a mere 7 knots, barely enough to outpace a leisurely rowboat. Maneuvering was awkward, balance was tenuous, and waves or wind could easily push it off course. Owners quickly realized that although it technically floated, it was neither a satisfying car nor a competent boat. Maintenance became a constant headache. Water exposure accelerated corrosion on the chassis, drivetrain, and suspension. Seals, gaskets, and propeller assemblies required near-constant attention, and every storage session demanded meticulous drying and cleaning to avoid rust. Parts were specialized and expensive, and few mechanics were trained to address the Amphicar's unique quirks. For many buyers, the excitement of owning a dual-purpose vehicle rapidly soured as the reality of upkeep set in. Insurance was another obstacle. Companies struggled to classify a vehicle that was part car, part boat, and often charged premiums that reflected the confusion and risk. Owning an Amphicar required not just money, but time, patience, and a willingness to live with constant compromise. Despite these drawbacks, the Amphicar 770 retains a cult following today, but mostly for its audacity rather than practicality. Owners and collectors celebrate it as a conversation piece, a rolling novelty, and a symbol of 1960s ambition unburdened by realism. They admire the creativity and humor behind a vehicle that was truly one of a kind, even if it failed spectacularly at its core promises. Driving an Amphicar today is more about the experience of absurdity than efficiency or performance, a reminder that sometimes the boldest ideas exist purely to inspire awe, laughter, and disbelief. The Amphicar 770 is therefore remembered less as a successful car or boat and more as a legend of impractical ingenuity. It highlights the extremes of automotive experimentation, the hazards of novelty without execution, and the curious charm of a vehicle that dared to break every conventional rule, only to prove that, in the end, you can't be a perfect car and a perfect boat at the same time. It is loved because it is hopeless, celebrated because it is impossible, and remains a testament to the wild ambition of engineers who dreamed bigger than common sense allowed.